In 1916, two men sat in a room and drew lines on a map. One was British. One was French. Between them, they divided a region that was home to millions of people who had never been consulted, never been asked, and would never forgive what happened next. Those lines created Iraq. They created Syria. They created Lebanon. They set in motion the forces that would lead to the creation of Israel and the displacement of the Palestinians. They split the Kurds, the largest ethnic group on earth without a country, across 4 nations. And 100 years later, almost every conflict in the modern Middle East traces back to this room, these men, and these lines. This is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And to understand why the Middle East looks the way it does today, you have to understand how two diplomats with a pencil reshaped a region that had existed for millennia. It starts with the Ottoman Empire. For 400 years, the Ottomans had governed the Arab world, from modern-day Iraq to Egypt, from Syria to the Arabian Peninsula. It was not a paradise. But it was a system. The millet system gave Christians, Jews, and Muslims their own courts, their own schools, their own community leaders. People identified by religion and family and tribe, not by nation. There was no Iraq. There was no Syria. There were Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, Basra, Damascus, Aleppo, Beirut, each with their own character, their own mix of peoples, their own way of functioning. When the First World War began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire made the decision that would destroy it. It sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. The British saw an opportunity. If the Arabs could be convinced to revolt against their Ottoman rulers, it would open a second front and weaken the Ottomans from within. So the British made a promise. In a series of letters between Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the guardian of Islam's holiest sites, Britain pledged to support Arab independence in exchange for an Arab uprising against the Ottomans. The territory promised was vast, essentially the entire Arab world minus some coastal areas where France had interests. Hussein believed the promise. In June 1916, he fired a rifle shot from his palace and launched the Arab revolt. His sons, Faisal and Abdullah, led armies across the desert. A British officer named T.E. Lawrence joined them as a liaison and helped coordinate the capture of the strategic port of Aqaba. The revolt tied down Ottoman forces, disrupted supply lines, and helped the British advance through Palestine. But while the Arabs were fighting and dying for the promise of independence, something else was happening in a room in London. Something the Arabs were not told about. In May 1916, the same month the revolt was being planned, Sir Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot finalized a secret agreement to carve up the exact territory that had been promised to the Arabs. France would get Syria and Lebanon. Britain would get Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. Russia would get Constantinople and parts of eastern Turkey. The Arabs would get nothing that mattered. The promise of independence was, at best, a carefully worded deception. At worst, a deliberate lie. The agreement was kept secret for over a year. Then, in November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, found the document in the Tsar's archives, and published it to embarrass the Western powers. The Arabs discovered they had been betrayed. The Ottomans published it too, hoping to turn the Arabs against the British. It almost worked. But by then, the revolt was too far along to stop. And that was not even the worst of it. 3 weeks before the Bolsheviks exposed Sykes-Picot, the British had made another promise. On November 2, 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild declaring that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. 67 carefully chosen words that would echo for the next century. Palestine, at the time, was 90% Arab. The people living there, farmers, merchants, scholars, families who had been there for generations, were referred to in the declaration as the existing non-Jewish communities. Not by name. Not by right. A footnote in someone else's promise. 3 promises. Arab independence. European partition. A Jewish homeland. All for the same land. All made within 2 years of each other. All fundamentally incompatible. And all made by the same government. When the war ended, the promises of independence evaporated. France marched into Damascus in July 1920 and expelled Faisal, the Arab prince who had led the revolt, who had been promised a kingdom. The French general Henri Gouraud reportedly visited the tomb of Saladin and said, "Saladin, we have returned. The Crusades are finished now." France carved Syria into pieces along sectarian lines. A state for the Alawites. A state for the Druze. A greater Lebanon expanded to include Sunni and Shia populations who had never asked to be part of it. The sectarian political system France designed for Lebanon, a Maronite Christian president, a Sunni Muslim prime minister, a Shia speaker of parliament, was built on a single census taken in 1932. It never updated. When the demographics shifted and the system no longer reflected reality, Lebanon tore itself apart. The civil war lasted 15 years and killed over 100,000 people. Britain created Iraq by stapling together 3 Ottoman provinces, Mosul in the Kurdish north, Baghdad in the Sunni center, and Basra in the Shia south. 3 communities with different languages, different religious traditions, and different interests, forced into one state because the British wanted Mosul's oil. They installed Faisal as king, the same Faisal France had expelled from Damascus. A Sunni Arab monarch ruling over a country that was 60% Shia. The structural crack that would eventually produce Saddam Hussein, the Iran-Iraq War, the 2003 invasion, and the rise of ISIS, all of it started with lines drawn on a map to protect an oil pipeline. And then there was Palestine. During the British Mandate, Jewish immigration increased steadily, driven by the promise of a homeland, by persecution in Europe, and ultimately by the Holocaust. The Arab population opposed the immigration. The British tried to manage both sides and satisfied neither. By 1947, they gave up and handed the problem to the United Nations. The UN proposed splitting Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jewish leadership accepted. The Arab leadership rejected it. They saw a plan giving 56% of the land to a community that owned 7% of it and constituted a third of the population. On May 14, 1948, the British withdrew and Israel declared independence. The next day, 5 Arab nations attacked. The war that followed created roughly 750,000 Palestinian refugees, displaced from homes they would never be allowed to return to. The Palestinians call it the Nakba. The catastrophe. Israelis call it the War of Independence. Both names are factually accurate descriptions of the same event seen from opposite sides of a line that 2 men drew in a London office 32 years earlier. In 2014, the Islamic State bulldozed the border crossing between Iraq and Syria and released a video titled "The End of Sykes-Picot." They understood something that Western policymakers had spent a century trying to ignore. The lines were never legitimate. The people who lived within them had never consented. And as long as those borders existed in their current form, there would be someone willing to die, or kill, to erase them. The Kurds, 30 million people spread across Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, have been fighting for a state of their own since the Treaty of Sèvres promised them one in 1920 and the Treaty of Lausanne erased the promise 3 years later. They held a referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan in 2017. 92% voted yes. The world said no. Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, Kurdistan. 6 stories of people forced into borders they did not choose, fighting wars that began before they were born, inheriting a map drawn by 2 men who never had to live inside it. Mark Sykes died of Spanish flu in 1919. He was 39. François-Georges Picot lived until 1951. Neither of them saw the full consequences of what they did. But the people inside those lines, they are still living them.